Welcome, and today we drift into a journey that goes deeper than words, into a story shaped by faith, endurance, and the quiet strength that grows in hidden places. As you listen, allow your heart to settle, your mind to open, and your spirit to receive what God has been preparing for you. Every moment in this message is designed to lift you, guide you, and remind you that you are never walking alone. If this message speaks to you, make sure to subscribe for more videos that will continue to strengthen your faith, encourage your soul, and draw you closer to God's purpose for your life. Let's begin. The story of Julius Caesar's assassination cannot begin at the moment of his death. It cannot begin with the conspirators in the Senate chamber or with the sharp glint of daggers hidden beneath the folds of white togas. It must begin long before that, in the dusty streets of ancient Rome, in a world filled with ambition, rivalry, political corruption, soaring victories, and a republic standing on legs that had already begun to wobble long before Caesar ever took center stage. Today, as we drift back through centuries, we enter a world trembling on the edge of transformation. Rome was the capital of an empire in everything except name, and yet the republic, its laws, traditions, and systems, was struggling to survive the weight of its own successes. The people were restless, the politicians were divided, and into this fragile world stepped one man whose destiny was as bright as it was dangerous, Gaius Julius Caesar. Imagine the Rome of Caesar's youth. Bustling markets, shouting vendors, senators stepping down from chariots, slaves running through winding alleys, triumphal processions echoing through the forum. Power was not simply held but fought for, argued over, traded, stolen, seized. Political life was an unending battlefield, and every ambitious man walked onto it with one dream: to leave his name carved into history. Caesar was not born into the highest class of Rome's elite, but he belonged to a respected, ancient family with just enough prestige to open a few doors, and just enough decline to make him hungry for more. Even as a young boy, Caesar lived in a world shaped by military heroes, legendary generals, and old men who still whispered about the days when Rome fought for its life against Hannibal. This atmosphere shaped him, sharpened him, filled him with a sense of destiny that never left him. From the beginning, Julius Caesar saw Rome not as it was, but as what it could be if a single, extraordinary leader took control and reshaped its future. Rome was already a force to be reckoned with, but its political structure was broken. Corruption ran deep, elections were bought and sold, bribery was the unofficial language of politics, noble families formed alliances not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Every year brought new conflicts, new dangers, and new opportunities. Caesar learned early that Rome rewarded those bold enough to take risks, and he was bold, perhaps more than anyone Rome had ever seen. As he entered his early political career, Caesar's charisma became his greatest weapon. He was a gifted speaker, able to turn crowds in his favor with nothing but his voice. He remembered everyone's name. He paid attention to the poor. He helped people who had nothing. He understood something other nobles ignored. The masses were not powerless. Win their hearts and you win Rome. Caesar began to rise step by step, earning positions, forming alliances, shaking hands, building a network of support that stretched across every corner of the republic. And through all of this, the whispers began. This man is dangerous. He is too ambitious. He wants more than he should. But even the whispers could not stop his rise. Meanwhile, Rome itself was changing. After centuries of expansion, the republic had become too large, too chaotic, too complex to be governed by the old systems of shared power. Civil wars had shaken the state. Generals were becoming more powerful than senators. The Senate was losing influence. Corruption grew like weeds between the cracks of the city's marble foundations. Many Romans felt the Republic was dying, others believed it could still be saved, but everyone sensed one thing clearly: the old world was ending, and a new one was coming. Into this world Caesar stepped, not cautiously, but confidently. His military campaigns, especially in Gaul, made him a hero among soldiers. Stories of his brilliance spread like wildfire: how he won battles against impossible odds, how he marched his men farther and faster than any general before him, how he turned defeat into victory with daring strategies that stunned allies and enemies alike. His soldiers adored him. They would follow him through snow, across mountains, into rivers, across battlefields soaked in blood, and with every victory Caesar's fame grew, and so did the fear among Rome's elite. The senators who believed in tradition watched Caesar with increasing anxiety. They had seen powerful generals before. They had seen men rise quickly. But Caesar was different. He was brilliant, popular, charismatic, and politically cunning. He was everything Rome admired and everything it feared. Every step he took made them more convinced that he was marching towards something forbidden, absolute power. To them, Caesar was not just another politician. He was a storm building over the Republic. The tension grew until finally Caesar crossed the Rubicon, a moment that changed history forever. With one decision, he defied the Senate, broke the rules of the Republic, and declared, without words, that he would not submit to their attempts to destroy him. Civil war followed, swift and decisive. Caesar defeated Pompey, his former ally turned rival. He returned to Rome not just as a victorious general, but as the most powerful man the Republic had ever seen. And in 44 BC, he was declared dictator for life, a title that sent shockwaves through the Senate. Many Romans loved him. They saw him as a savior, a reformer, a visionary, but others saw him as the end of everything Rome once stood for. The Republic had been built on the fear of kings, not just dislike, but hatred so deep that even the word king was poison. Centuries earlier, Rome had driven out its last king, vowing never again to be ruled by a single man. The Senate believed monarchy was a threat to freedom itself, and yet here was Caesar, receiving honors that looked very much like those given to ancient kings. Rumors spread that Caesar planned to be crowned. Some said he intended to change Rome from a republic to a monarchy. Others believed he wanted to become a living god, worshipped by the people. Whether these rumors were true or not, the Senate believed them. And belief is all that matters when fear becomes the guiding force. As Caesar continued to implement reforms, rebuilding Rome's calendar, redistributing land, forgiving debts, centralizing power, the senators watched in dread. Caesar's every action, even if beneficial, seemed like a step toward total control. The old guard felt themselves slipping away. They feared that one day soon the Senate would be nothing more than decoration, a powerless institution overshadowed by Caesar's authority. Rome, the Republic, the system they cherished, the identity they were raised to defend, everything was at risk. Whispers turned to meetings, meetings turned to plans, plans turned to conspiracy. And at the heart of it all was a growing belief shared by dozens of senators. Julius Caesar had become too powerful, too beloved, and too untouchable. If he was not stopped, they believed Rome would cease to be the republic their ancestors built. But before that fatal decision could be carried out, before knives could be sharpened and alliances secretly formed, before the Ides of March shadowed Caesar's final day, the story of his rise must be understood. Because it is impossible to understand his assassination without understanding the world that created him, the ambition that drove him, the political chaos that made him, and the fear that surrounded him. Caesar walked with confidence through Rome, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his destiny was pulling him toward a moment that even he could not control. He had reshaped Rome, changed its trajectory, and placed himself at the center of everything. But the closer he got to absolute power, the more dangerous his world became. Friends whispered behind closed doors, enemies smiled to his face. The Senate watched him with eyes that saw both the glory of Rome's future and the threat of its destruction. And so, as we stand on the edge of this story, looking out over the ancient world, we see a Rome divided, hopeful, terrified, and at a crossroads. We see a man admired by millions and feared by hundreds, a leader whose brilliance burned so brightly that it blinded the very people who once supported him, a man whose dream for Rome was destined to clash with the dreams of those who believed he was becoming a tyrant. This is where the journey begins, not at Caesar's death, but long before it, when his rise set the stage for everything that followed. For in understanding how Rome shaped Caesar, we understand why Rome ended up killing him. Julius Caesar's rise to power was not accidental, nor was it the result of a single moment of luck or opportunity. It was the outcome of decades of ambition, calculation, struggle, and an almost supernatural belief in his own destiny. To understand why Caesar became the most powerful man in Rome, one must step into the mind of a man who believed he was born for greatness, and into a republic that was slowly collapsing under its own weight, becoming the perfect stage for a figure like him to rise. Caesar's ascent was a storm building over years, beginning small, gathering momentum, and eventually becoming unstoppable. As a young man, Caesar was not yet the towering figure history remembers. He was thin, elegant, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. Born into the Julian clan, a noble family with a proud history, Caesar carried a name that connected him to legends. His ancestors claimed descent from Aeneas, the Trojan hero, and from the goddess Venus herself. Whether or not he believed every myth, Caesar certainly believed in the idea that he was destined for something extraordinary. This belief would fuel every decision he made, but Rome was not interested in destiny. Rome demanded proof in war, proof in politics, proof in the ability to win over the masses. Caesar understood this better than anyone. From a young age, he cultivated skills that would become his weapons: eloquence, charm, courage, political awareness, and an almost magnetic ability to draw people to him. He trained as an orator, mastering the power of speech, learning how to move crowds, how to persuade enemies, how to bend opinions with words alone. Yet early in life, he also faced hardship that shaped him. When Sulla, the ruthless dictator, seized control of Rome, he declared Caesar an enemy because of his family ties to political rivals. Caesar was forced to flee, hunted by soldiers, his property confiscated, his life hanging by a thread. At a time when most young aristocrats enjoyed comfort and privilege, Caesar was learning the harsh lessons of survival. He hid in the countryside, constantly moving, narrowly escaping capture. Eventually, thanks to influential friends, Sulla spared his life, but grudgingly warning that the young Caesar was a dangerous young man whose ambition would one day cause trouble. Sulla wasn't wrong. When he returned to Rome, Caesar began rebuilding his life from the ground up. He joined the military, a respected path for ambitious men. His bravery quickly became legendary. During battles in Asia Minor, he fought so fiercely that his commander awarded him the civic crown, a rare honor given only to soldiers who saved the lives of fellow Romans in combat. Caesar wore that crown proudly for the rest of his life, a symbol of both courage and reputation. But it wasn't only on the battlefield that Caesar shined. His charisma brought people naturally to him, from soldiers to common citizens to respected politicians. He knew how to appear humble yet confident, generous yet strategic, relatable yet authoritative. He began borrowing money, vast sums, from wealthy allies like Crassus, the richest man in Rome. It was a dangerous gamble, but Caesar understood something his rivals didn't. In Rome, popularity could be purchased, but loyalty had to be earned. He spent freely: public feasts, games, festivals, gifts for the poor, personal favors for influential men, paid support in elections. Critics mocked him as irresponsible, wasteful, even reckless. But Caesar saw the future clearly. Every denarius spent today would return tenfold when he held higher office. Rome, at this time, was falling deeper into corruption. Elections were marred by bribery. Senators fought each other with gangs in the streets. The poor were starving. The rich were feuding. Generals were becoming more powerful than the government itself. The old republican system was cracking, unable to handle the weight of an expanding empire that needed stronger leadership. Amidst this chaos, Caesar maneuvered with precision, understanding that the people were desperate for someone who could fix Rome's problems. He promised change, reform, hope, and the crowds believed him. As he climbed through the political ranks, he gained fame as both a brilliant speaker and a master of public spectacle. When he became aedile, he spent enormous amounts of borrowed money on lavish games and gladiator shows. These events drew massive crowds, and Caesar became a hero to the common people. The Senate grumbled, accusing him of trying to buy popularity, but it didn't matter. Caesar was building something far more powerful than momentary applause. He was building a loyal base of support, a foundation upon which his future power would stand. Then came one of the most significant moves of his early career, the formation of the first triumvirate, an alliance with Pompey the Great and Crassus. It was an alliance that reshaped Roman politics. Pompey was Rome's greatest general, loved by soldiers and respected by senators. Crassus was the wealthiest man in the empire, capable of funding any political dream. Caesar, ambitious yet lacking the resources to challenge Rome alone, brought something neither of them had: the support of the masses and the strategic brilliance to unify their interests. Together, the three men dominated Roman politics, controlling elections, passing laws, and bending the republic to their combined will. With their backing, Caesar became consul, one of the highest offices in Rome, and from there secured a position as governor over Gaul, a vast territory in modern-day France and Belgium. It was in Gaul that Caesar's rise transformed into something far greater than political success. In Gaul, Caesar became a conqueror. The Gallic Wars would define his legacy, facing dozens of tribes, countless warriors, and fierce resistance. Caesar led one of the most ambitious military campaigns in Roman history. He showed unparalleled tactical genius, splitting his forces when needed, uniting them when it mattered, building bridges across impossible rivers, conducting sieges with terrifying efficiency, and inspiring his men with speeches that made them believe defeat was impossible. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars reveal not only his military brilliance, but his understanding of psychology. He made the world believe that Rome's victories were inevitable under his leadership. Gaul made Caesar wealthy beyond imagination. It gave him veteran soldiers who adored him. It gave him fame that spread across Rome like wildfire, and most importantly, it made him indispensable. With every victory, his power grew, and with every month, the Senate's fear deepened. They watched as Caesar wrote his own name into the map of Europe. They watched as he sent treasure after treasure back to Rome, funding more games, more celebrations, more monuments, ensuring the people remembered his name. They watched as the loyalty of his soldiers surpassed anything they had seen before. Caesar's men were not just soldiers, they were his brothers, bound to him by loyalty, respect, and shared hardship. They marched through forests, crossed snow-covered mountains, and fought battles in brutal conditions, all because they believed in Caesar. This terrified the Senate. To them, Caesar was no longer just a politician or a general. He was becoming a kingmaker, or worse, a king himself, and so the Senate, urged on by Caesar's rivals, demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. This was a trap. Without his army, Caesar would be prosecuted, humiliated, politically destroyed. His enemies would finally have their revenge, but Caesar was not a man who allowed others to dictate his fate. When he reached the Rubicon River, the boundary separating Gaul from Italy, he faced the most important decision of his life. Roman law strictly forbade a general from crossing into Italy with troops. To do so was an act of war against the state. Caesar stood at the river's edge, thinking of his life, his men, his destiny. The stakes were enormous. If he crossed, he would start a civil war. If he didn't, his enemies would crush him. Caesar chose ambition, he chose destiny, he chose Rome, on his own terms, with the words Alia iactuisti, the die is cast. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It was the moment the Republic began to fall and the Empire began to rise. Civil war erupted. Pompey, once his ally, became his greatest rival. But Caesar moved with lightning speed, winning battle after battle, driving Pompey out of Italy, defeating him in Greece, and eventually chasing him to Egypt, where Pompey was murdered by foreign officials hoping to win Caesar's favor, an act that Caesar condemned, though it helped eliminate his most powerful opponent. When Caesar returned to Rome, the city welcomed him as a hero. He pardoned his enemies, a gesture that surprised many. It made him appear merciful, generous, even noble, but it also made him untouchable. His enemies could not openly oppose him because he had spared them. His supporters praised him as a savior. His soldiers stood ready to defend him, and the Senate, weakened by years of conflict, bowed to him. Caesar became dictator, not for months, as tradition dictated, but for years, eventually for life. This final step was the moment that transformed Caesar's rise from impressive to unprecedented. Never before had one man held so much power in Rome. He passed reforms, rebuilt the calendar, improved the lives of the poor, restructured the government, and centralized authority in ways that made many Romans feel that he was restoring order to a broken state. To the common people, Caesar was a hero. To the elite, he was a threat. To some, he was a visionary. To others, he was a tyrant. The truth is that Caesar's rise was a combination of brilliance, opportunity, bold decisions, and a republic that had already begun to crumble. He filled a void Rome didn't even know it had. He offered stability in chaos, leadership in uncertainty, and hope during political decay. But the very qualities that made him indispensable to Rome also made him dangerous to those who clung to the old system. They saw in him not a savior, but a warning, a glimpse of a future where one man ruled with unchecked authority. Caesar had risen to the top of the world, but with every step, he grew further removed from the traditions that had once defined the Republic. The Senate watched him with suspicion. The elites whispered behind his back. Rumors spread, alliances formed, and a storm quietly gathered in the hearts of men who believed that Caesar's rise had gone too far. His ascent was not just the rise of a man, it was the rise of a new era, and the closer Caesar came to achieving absolute power, the more determined his enemies became to stop him, even if it meant killing him. To understand why Julius Caesar was assassinated, we must step inside the minds of the Roman senators, men shaped by centuries of tradition, raised to believe that the Republic was sacred, and convinced that the greatest threat to their world was not a foreign enemy, but the rise of a single man who seemed capable of swallowing Rome whole. The motivations behind Caesar's assassination were not as simple as envy or hatred. They were woven from fear, pride, honor, political survival, misinterpretation, and the deep anxiety of watching Rome, the Rome they believed belonged to them, slip through their fingers. For hundreds of years, Rome had been proud of one thing above all: it had no king. The Romans despised the idea of monarchy with a passion unmatched by any other civilization. They believed a king was not just a ruler, but a destroyer of liberty, a threat to collective freedom, a figure who transformed citizens into subjects. Their entire political system, the Senate, the consuls, the tribunes, the assemblies, was designed to prevent exactly what they feared was now happening under Caesar's rule, the centralization of power in the hands of one extraordinary man. As Caesar accumulated victories, influence, and honors, this fear grew. Senators whispered in corridors, exchanged glances in the forum, wrote secret letters, formed alliances. They began to believe, or convince themselves, that they were fighting not for political gain, but for the survival of the Republic. The irony is that many of them genuinely believed they were heroes. They believed that history would honor them as saviors, that Rome would thank them for removing a man they saw as a tyrant. What they could not see, or refused to see, was that the Republic they wished to protect had already begun to fade long before Caesar ever appeared on the stage. But perception often outweighs truth, and in the world of Roman politics, rumors could reshape reality. One of the most dangerous rumors was that Caesar wanted to be crowned king. Whether Caesar actually had such intentions remains debated, but in the Senate, perception became fact. During festivals, the people shouted for Caesar to take a crown. Some believed he staged these shouts to test public reaction. Others thought they were spontaneous displays of admiration. During ceremonies, Caesar accepted honors with a calmness that terrified his enemies. Every golden statue, every triumph, every privilege granted to him by the Senate felt, to his opponents, like one more step toward monarchy. And then came the incident that pushed many senators past their breaking point, the Lupercalia festival. A massive crowd watched as Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, attempted to place a diadem, a symbol of kingship, upon Caesar's head. Caesar refused it once, twice, theatrically, dramatically, in a way that left everyone unsure of his true intentions. Some believed this was all a performance, that Caesar wanted to appear reluctant so he could later claim kingship was forced upon him. Others believed that Antony acted on his own, but the senators, already on edge, interpreted the scene as proof. In their minds, Caesar wanted to be king. He was playing with symbols, using the people, manipulating emotions, preparing Rome for the return of monarchy. Fear hardened into certainty. To understand their perspective, one must imagine the world they lived in, a city where power had always been divided, where alliances and rivalries created a delicate balance, where even the strongest political figures had to negotiate, persuade, and compromise. But Caesar was changing everything. He appointed senators, controlled elections, passed reforms without serious opposition, and filled key positions with men loyal only to him. These actions frightened the old aristocracy, who viewed themselves as the guardians of tradition. They looked at the Republic's centuries, old institutions, and saw them bending around Caesar as though he were the center of gravity. Some senators acted out of personal hostility. Men like Cassius disliked Caesar, feared his ambition, and resented his authority. They felt overshadowed by his brilliance, humiliated by his victories, made insignificant by the sheer scale of his achievements. Others, like Brutus, acted out of philosophical principles. Brutus was a man raised on the ideals of the Republic, taught to revere Rome's ancient values, trained to despise tyranny in all its forms, yet Brutus's motives were not simple. His family carried a legacy of resisting kings. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had helped overthrow Rome's last king centuries earlier. The weight of that lineage pressed on him. Many conspirators deliberately played on this heritage, whispering that only Brutus could save Rome, that destiny called him to act, that failing to stop Caesar would betray his own blood. Brutus was torn. He respected Caesar, admired him, even loved him as a friend. Yet every new honor given to Caesar made Brutus's internal conflict deeper. Cassius, the true mastermind of the conspiracy, knew exactly how to manipulate Brutus by appealing to his moral convictions, his fears of tyranny, and his desire to be a protector of Roman liberty. Cassius understood something crucial. The conspiracy needed Brutus not just for his intellect or influence, but because his name alone could make the assassination appear noble. Without Brutus, the assassination would look like a jealous mob murdering a popular leader. With Brutus, it would appear to be a principled defense of the Republic, and so Cassius worked on him with precision. Every rumor that Caesar wanted to be king was brought to Brutus's attention. Every honor given to Caesar was framed as a threat. Every worry, every whisper, every exaggerated story was fed into Brutus's mind until he began to see Caesar not as a friend, but as a danger to Rome's freedom. Brutus convinced himself that killing Caesar was not murder, but sacrifice, necessary, painful, tragic, but just. Cassius pushed him until he finally agreed. With Brutus on board, the conspiracy gained credibility and momentum. More senators joined, some from fear of Caesar, some from hatred, some because they believed Rome needed saving, and others simply because they were persuaded that if Caesar continued unchecked, the Senate's power would disappear forever. The conspirators gathered in the shadows, meeting secretly in small groups, exchanging coded messages and plotting Caesar's downfall. They debated where to kill him, how to kill him, and when. They needed to strike in a place where Caesar would be exposed, where he could not escape, and where the act would appear political rather than personal. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March provided the perfect opportunity. But even as they prepared, doubts remained. Caesar had immense popularity among the masses. Killing him might spark riots, rebellions, or revenge, but the conspirators convinced themselves that Rome would understand. They told themselves the people would rejoice in the restoration of liberty. They imagined cheers, not screams, praise, not outrage. In their minds, the assassination was not a crime, but a final, desperate act of patriotism. As the day approached, omens were reported throughout the city, strange lights in the sky, animals behaving oddly, priests warning of danger, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, experiencing terrifying dreams of his death. Even soothsayers urged Caesar to be cautious, yet the conspirators believed fate was on their side. They told themselves that the gods favored their cause, that Rome itself was asking them to take bold action. What none of them understood was that Caesar's power had grown far beyond the Senate. He was not merely a politician or a general, he was a symbol of victory, of prosperity, of stability. The common people adored him. Soldiers worshipped him, even many senators respected him. Killing Caesar would not restore the Republic. It would plunge Rome into chaos. But the conspirators, blinded by fear and pride, could not see this. They believed that eliminating Caesar would save Rome. They believed the Republic would rise again, stronger than ever. They believed history would celebrate them. They believed wrong. What drove them to act was not a single reason but a storm of motives: fear of monarchy, anger at lost influence, resentment at Caesar's power, jealousy of his success, anxiety about the future, philosophical devotion to the Republic, manipulation by Cassius, the heavy weight of family legacy, and the intoxicating idea that they alone could change the fate of Rome. They convinced themselves that Caesar had become too powerful, too popular, too essential. They believed that if they did not stop him now, they never would. They believed that Caesar lived at the expense of their own relevance. They believed that killing him was the only way to restore balance. And most tragically, they believed that Rome would thank them. In truth, their plot was based not on clarity, but on illusion, an illusion of a republic that no longer existed, an illusion of unity that had already dissolved, an illusion that one death could fix decades of political sickness. They imagined themselves as liberators. but history would soon reveal that they were merely the catalysts of Rome's final descent into empire. The conspirators sharpened their daggers, hardened their hearts, and stepped into a moment they believed would define their legacy with glory. Instead, it would define their downfall. The Ides of March began like any other day in Rome, but beneath the surface of the bustling capital, a tension simmered so quietly that only the most sensitive eyes could recognize it. Dawn broke over the city with a faint golden hue, the early sunlight catching on marble rooftops and the copper helmets of rising legionaries. Vendors were pushing carts into the forum, slaves hurried through narrow streets carrying baskets and scrolls, and senators in their elegant white togas made their way toward the curia, thinner lines of worry etched into their faces than usual. Rome did not yet know that within a few hours its entire political world would be shattered. Inside the home of Julius Caesar, there was restlessness long before the sun rose. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, had woken trembling from a nightmare so vivid that she clung to her husband's shoulders, urging him not to leave the house. For weeks she had felt something ominous stirring, a feeling of darkness building behind the veneer of daily Roman routine. But last night's dream was the most terrifying of all. She saw their home collapse in flames, saw Caesar bleeding in her arms, saw Romans crying in the streets. She felt as though the gods were screaming warnings into her mind. Caesar listened, at first amused and then increasingly contemplative. He had never dismissed Calpurnia's instincts outright. She was intelligent, observant, and in her own way, more politically perceptive than many senators. But he was also a man who had spent decades staring death in the face. He had crossed battlefields that swallowed thousands of men, faced Germanic tribesmen who towered over Roman soldiers, survived sea storms, political enemies, and countless assassination rumors. A dream, even a vivid one, felt trivial in comparison, yet something in Calpurnia's trembling voice unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Adding to her anxiety were the reports of strange omens in the city that morning. The priests had examined the entrails of a sacrificed animal and found no heart, a sign of catastrophe. People whispered that a great statue of Caesar had been struck by lightning weeks earlier, its metal frame cracked down the center. A soothsayer had even warned Caesar only days before, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar dismissed him with a wave, but those words lingered in memory, resurfacing now like a ghost in his mind. Despite all these warnings, Caesar believed himself protected by destiny. He felt an almost divine certainty that his life was guided by forces no Roman could comprehend. He had accomplished more than any living person, perhaps more than any Roman in history. He was dictator perpetuo dictator for life. He was the man who had reformed the calendar, crushed Pompey's legions, pardoned his enemies, reshaped the Senate, expanded Roman territory, and won the adoration of soldiers and common people alike. Why should he fear a few nervous priests or a frightened dream? Yet Calpurnia begged him repeatedly, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. In a rare gesture of tenderness, Caesar relented for a moment. He agreed to stay home and sent a message to the Senate saying he would not attend. This decision, though small, sent ripples of panic through certain corners of Rome, specifically the homes of the conspirators. For weeks they had plotted his assassination, timed precisely to happen at the Senate meeting scheduled that morning in the theater of Pompey. The location, ironically, was the hall built to honor Caesar's greatest former rival. It was a temporary venue while the main Senate house was being reconstructed, but its wide entrances and open floor spaces made it ideal for the conspirators' plan. They had chosen the Ides of March specifically because enough senators would be present, enough daggers could be hidden, and the political atmosphere would mask any sudden movement, as long as Caesar showed up. When Caesar's message arrived saying he would not attend, anxiety exploded among the conspirators. Cassius, Brutus, Casca, Cimber, Trebonius, and the others were nearly paralyzed with fear that their plot had already collapsed. They knew if Caesar stayed home, he might never again be vulnerable in the way they needed. His guard would tighten, his suspicions would grow, their window would close, and the consequences for being discovered were unthinkable. Immediately, they sent word to one of Caesar's closest associates, Decimus Brutus, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus, the more famous conspirator. Decimus was a man Caesar trusted deeply. He had fought beside Caesar in Gaul, enjoyed his friendship, and benefited from his political favor. Caesar once described him as nearly a son, and yet Decimus was also one of the traitors. His role in the conspiracy was pivotal. He would persuade Caesar to come to the Senate despite the warnings. When Decimus entered Caesar's home, he found the dictator standing still in contemplation, Calpurnia hovering near him in anxious silence. Decimus took a deep breath, then began speaking with practiced calmness. He played on Caesar's pride. He suggested that if Caesar stayed home because of dreams, the Senate would think him weak. Rumors might spread that he was afraid. His enemies would whisper that he was losing his nerve. And worst of all, his absence would insult the senators and breed resentment. Caesar's expression hardened. Pride, more than any other force, had driven his actions for years, and it was not the pride of ego alone. It was the pride of destiny. He believed he had been chosen by fate to rule Rome and transform it. The idea that he might be seen as weak or superstitious was unbearable. Calpurnia, seeing Caesar's resolve returning, looked crestfallen. She cried quietly, begging him once more to reconsider, but Caesar gently held her and told her not to worry. Everything would be fine. His confidence was not arrogance. It was a kind of fatal calm, the certainty of a man who had long believed the gods favored him. With Decimus at his side, Caesar stepped out of his home and into the morning light. If he sensed that Rome seemed strangely tense, he gave no sign. The streets were filled with the usual crowds, though whispers followed him more than usual. Some citizens bowed deeply, others looked away nervously, some kept glancing at the theater where the Senate meeting would be held. Rumors had spread that something significant was going to happen today, though most people assumed it would be a new decree or political announcement. On the way to the Senate, Caesar encountered the soothsayer who had warned him earlier. Caesar, half amused, said, "The Ides of March have come." The soothsayer replied quietly, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." Caesar dismissed the comment with a small laugh. Destiny still felt like a shield around him. As he approached the theater of Pompey, more ominous signs appeared. Men who looked unusually tense, senators who forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and a few figures who vanished quickly behind columns when Caesar's entourage drew near. But Caesar was accustomed to being watched, feared, admired, envied. Suspicious behavior was nothing new. What was new was the atmosphere inside the theater once he entered. The conspirators were already assembled, each trying to control their breathing, their nervous glances, the sweat building beneath their togas. Some clutched hidden daggers so tightly that their hands trembled. Others rehearsed their roles in their minds, who would speak first, who would distract, who would strike. To calm their nerves, the conspirators acted overly friendly, greeting Caesar with wide smiles and respectful bows. Caesar, unaware of the falseness around him, greeted several of them warmly. He even joked lightly with a few, unaware that beneath their smiles were murderous intentions waiting for the perfect moment. The Senate chamber was designed like a semicircle, with rows of marble seats surrounding the central floor. Caesar took his place near the statue of Pompey, the man he had defeated in civil war years before. The irony was not lost on the conspirators. To kill Caesar at the feet of Pompey's image felt symbolic, poetic, almost divine justice to those who believed Caesar had destroyed the Republic by crushing Pompey's faction. The moment Caesar took his seat, the conspirators moved into position. Tullius Cimber stepped forward, pretending to petition Caesar on behalf of his exiled brother. This was the agreed-upon signal. Cimber pleaded with Caesar to reverse his brother's exile, but Caesar shook his head firmly. Cimber pleaded again, pushing closer. Caesar frowned, irritated at the breach of decorum. Then Cimber grabbed Caesar's Togane act that stunned everyone in the room. Caesar reacted sharply, saying, "Why, this is violence." Those were likely some of his last coherent words. At that instant, Casca, standing just behind Caesar, drew his dagger and struck, but his blow was clumsy and shallow, perhaps because his hands were shaking, perhaps because he lost his nerve at the final moment. Caesar twisted around, grabbed Casca's arm, and shouted, "Villain, what are you doing?" The chamber erupted into chaos. The conspirators swarmed him like wolves, daggers flashing in the faint light of the hall. Senators nearby gasped and stumbled backward, some fleeing toward the exits. The air filled with the sound of cloth ripping, steel slicing flesh, footsteps scraping on marble, and Caesar's voice rising in shock and fury. At first, Caesar fought back. He was a soldier, after all. He grabbed arms, dodged blows, and tried to push himself away from his attackers, but there were too many, and when he saw one face in particular, Marcus Junius Brutus, something inside him collapsed. Brutus was not just a conspirator. He was someone Caesar had loved like a son, someone whose honor he believed in, someone he trusted deeply. To see Brutus raising a dagger against him felt like betrayal deeper than any sword wound could reach. According to ancient accounts, it was this moment, not the knives, that broke Caesar's will. He ceased resisting. His shoulders slumped. His eyes lost their fire. He pulled his toga over his face, not out of fear, but out of dignity, not wanting to be seen in the vulnerable moment of his death. And then he fell. Some say he whispered, "You too, Brutus." Others say he said nothing at all. What mattered was the expression of disbelief and heartbreak that crossed his face as he surrendered to the inevitable. The conspirators continued stabbing long after he fell. In the frenzy, they stabbed each other more than once. Blood sprayed across the marble floor, splashed onto the statue of Pompey, and pooled beneath Caesar's body. By the time they stopped, he had been stabbed at least 23 times, though only one wound, the second or third, had actually been fatal. When the final blow was struck, the chamber fell into a chilling silence. Senators who had hidden began creeping out from behind pillars. Some stared in horror, others fled outright. The conspirators, breathing heavily, blood staining their arms and togas, stood over Caesar's body with mixed expressions: relief, pride, fear, shock, and a few with immediate regret. They had killed the most powerful man in the world, but in that moment, standing in a pool of blood under the cold gaze of Pompey's statue, they realized something terrifying. They had no idea what would happen next. Rome outside did not yet know that history had just been rewritten in violence, but the repercussions were already set in motion. The Ides of March had claimed its victim, and the Rome that Julius Caesar had shaped with such force and ambition was about to plunge into chaos from which the Republic would never return. When the final echoes of steel and desperate gasps faded within the Senate chamber, a stillness fell over the theater of Pompey, so strange and heavy that it felt as if the air itself refused to move. Julius Caesar, once the most powerful man in Rome, now lay lifeless on the cold marble floor, his blood seeping into the grooves between the stones like an omen spreading through the veins of the Republic. The conspirators stood above him in a tight semicircle, their breaths ragged, their hands trembling not only from violence but from the sudden realization of what they had done. In their minds, they had just saved Rome. In reality, they had opened the gates for something far more uncontrollable and destructive. One by one, the conspirators began to step away from Caesar's body. Some looked victorious, some looked shaken. One or two looked almost sick with dread. Cassius, the sharp mind behind the assassination, tried to steady the group, urging them to stay calm. Brutus, the moral pillar of the conspiracy, was pale, not triumphant, not relieved, but quietly devastated. Although he had convinced himself that this act was for the good of Rome, the image of Caesar collapsing before him lingered in his thoughts like a stain he could not erase. There was no cheering, no applause, no sense of accomplishment, only the cold truth: Caesar was dead, and now they had to face the Roman world. The conspirators believed they would be greeted as liberators. They imagined senators rushing in to thank them, citizens praising their courage, and Rome welcoming the return of liberty. But the first sign of trouble came almost immediately. Instead of receiving admiration, they found the other senators staring at them with horror. Men fled from the Senate house like frightened birds escaping a fire. Some did not even look back, others covered their heads. A few thought the conspirators might try to kill more people. Panic seeped into the corridors and moved outward into the streets. As the conspirators exited the theater, swords still stained red, they expected cheers. Instead, many citizens recoiled in confusion, backing away quickly. A few asked what had happened. Others whispered among themselves, uncertain and afraid to approach the armed men. Rome was a city deeply bound to spectacles, but this spectacle felt wrong. It felt too raw, too uncontrolled. Murder, even political murder, was never something Romans celebrated openly. They loved strength, not treachery. They admired victory, not civil bloodshed. The conspirators' confidence began to crack. Cassius whispered urgently to Brutus as they walked, urging him to address the people, to explain what they had done and why. They had planned this moment carefully. Brutus, with his noble reputation and ancestral legacy, would stand before the Roman public and declare that Caesar had been struck down to protect their freedom. Only Brutus could calm the crowd, only Brutus could justify their actions, but as they made their way toward the forum, the reactions of the people became clearer: confusion, fear, and above all, skepticism. Meanwhile, Caesar's body still lay in the Senate chamber. Hours passed before loyal slaves and attendants were allowed to enter. The conspirators had left it abandoned as they focused on seizing political control. When the slaves finally approached the great fallen figure, they wept openly, gathering their fallen master with trembling hands. His toga was shredded, stained almost entirely dark with blood. His limbs were twisted unnaturally. His face, once full of command, was now pale and empty. They carried him home silently, slipping through alleys to avoid the crowds, because even the return of Caesar's corpse could spark uncontrollable reactions. Back in the streets of Rome, the conspirators soon realized how badly they had miscalculated the mood of the city. Rome loved Julius Caesar. He had given them games, land, food, forgiveness, and hope. He had given countless soldiers land and rewards. He had forgiven enemies and shown kindness to those who once fought him. He was not merely a ruler, he was a symbol of possibility. His assassination was not seen as liberation. It was seen as the violent theft of a beloved leader. The conspirators felt the change in atmosphere immediately. Still believing they had the moral high ground, they marched to the Capitol, the traditional refuge of those who believed they had acted for the Republic's sake. They intended to gather allies, deliver speeches, and shape public opinion, but as the day wore on, their confidence weakened. No crowds gathered to cheer them, no senators rushed to join their cause. People were whispering, but none of the whispers sounded like support. Rome was tense, anxious, and ready to explode. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, Caesar's closest political ally and his co-consul that year, had not been killed. The conspirators had debated whether to eliminate him as well, but Brutus refused. He insisted that their actions must appear pure, restrained, and righteous. Killing Antony would make them look like butchers, not liberators. This decision would prove catastrophic. Antony, upon hearing what happened, acted with a mix of fear, intelligence, and instinct. He disguised his emotions carefully. He did not rush blindly into the Senate to confront the assassins. Instead, he waited, listened, and gathered information. He knew that he alone could not defeat the conspirators, but he also knew that the people adored Caesar and could be used as a powerful weapon if he acted strategically. Antony's grief was genuine, but he also understood the political opportunity rising from it. He sent word to the conspirators, negotiating carefully to avoid being killed next. He sought assurances of safety, then slowly maneuvered himself toward Rome's center of influence. When Caesar's body was finally prepared for public display, Antony saw a chance to swing the entire city in his favor. He arranged a funeral in the Forum, a place where Caesar had spoken countless times, where he had addressed the people, led triumphs, and shaped history. Caesar's death would be turned into a spectacle, but not the one the conspirators had imagined. Antony intended to ignite the anger of Rome. The day of the funeral was unlike anything the city had experienced before. Tens of thousands gathered. People filled the streets, climbed columns, stood on rooftops. The grief was thick and palpable. Many Roman citizens cried as Caesar's body was carried through the Forum on a bier draped in purple, the color of royalty, the color of power. His lifeless form was visible to all, his wounds exposed for the world to see. Antony stepped forward, ready to deliver a speech that would transform everything. His words did not need to be crafted with perfection. They only needed to strike at the heart of the Roman people. And they did. He raised Caesar's torn and blood-soaked toga before the crowd, lifting the fabric high so that every man, woman, and child could see the holes and tears left by the conspirators' knives. The sight alone sent ripples of outrage through the masses. He described each wound. He named the conspirators. He emphasized the betrayal, the brutality, the ingratitude. He spoke not as a politician, but as a grieving friend and loyal servant. He painted Caesar not as a tyrant, but as a generous father of Rome. His voice broke. He cried. He shouted. He lowered his tone to despair. He raised it to fury. The Roman crowd, already emotionally fragile, erupted with anger. Their grief turned to rage when Antony revealed Caesar's will, promising money to every citizen and leaving his gardens to the public. The crowd reached a breaking point. Caesar had loved them. He had cared for them. And he had been murdered by men who claimed to represent the Republic. The people surged with fury. Someone threw a torch onto the bier. Flames engulfed the platform. The crowd roared. Men grabbed whatever they could find, clubs, stones, even pieces of wood, and ran through the streets shouting for vengeance. The conspirators, hiding in the Capitol, heard the screams. They peeked from the windows and saw the fire rising from the Forum. They saw mobs rushing toward their homes, destroying property, tearing down statues, burning furniture, and threatening their families. Rome had not accepted their version of events. Rome had chosen Caesar. In desperation, the conspirators fled. Some escaped the city under cover of night. Others hid in allies' homes. A few tried to gather senators to their side, but fear kept most politicians silent. Antony had seized control of the narrative. Caesar had become not a dictator to fear, but a martyr to mourn. Yet even Antony could not control what came next. Rome plunged into chaos unlike anything it had seen in decades. The city was full of suspicion. Factions began forming. Political alliances shifted daily. People argued in the streets, fought outside temples, and held nightly debates in taverns. Which Rome would survive? Caesar's Rome or the conspirators' republic? Into this chaos stepped a new figure. Young, quiet, seemingly inexperienced, but carrying a name that Rome could not ignore. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year old heir. When Octavian arrived in Rome, many expected little from him. But he possessed something extraordinary: patience, intelligence, and a heart of iron. And he had Caesar's name, a name the Roman people now worshipped. Antony initially underestimated Octavian. But soon the young heir began winning the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, forming a political base, and showing a shrewdness that belied his age. Rome was now a battlefield, political, emotional, and soon literal. Caesar's assassination had not restored the Republic. It had fractured it beyond repair. Within months, alliances shifted and reformed. Antony and Octavian clashed, then joined forces temporarily. Brutus and Cassius raised armies in the east. Rome split into factions, those who supported Caesar's legacy and those who believed they were fighting to restore the old republic. But the republic was already dead. It had died the moment Caesar fell. The conspirators had not restored freedom. They had unleashed civil war. 2 years later, Brutus and Cassius met Antony and Octavian at the Battle of Philippi. It was brutal. The ground ran red with Roman blood. Tens of thousands died fighting fellow Romans. Brutus and Cassius, realizing their cause was lost, both committed suicide, choosing death over the humiliation of defeat. With their deaths, the last hope of reviving the Republic vanished. Back in Rome, the survivors of Caesar's faction continued to fight among themselves. Antony and Octavian eventually turned on each other. The resulting conflict ended in the Battle of Actium, where Octavian triumphed. Antony fled with Cleopatra to Egypt, where both eventually died by their own hands, leaving Octavian the sole master of Rome, and so the young man, once dismissed as a mere boy, became the uncontested ruler of the Mediterranean world. He took a new title, Augustus. Under him, the Roman Republic transformed fully into the Roman Empire. The political system the conspirators had claimed to save became nothing more than a memory, preserved in name but hollow in function. Their assassination of Julius Caesar had achieved the opposite of what they intended. Instead of saving the Republic, they destroyed it. Instead of preventing monarchy, they paved the way for imperial rule. Instead of eliminating tyranny, they created the conditions for Rome's first emperor. Caesar's death became the catalyst that transformed Rome forever. The aftermath of Caesar's assassination teaches a profound lesson that history repeats across cultures and centuries. When leaders fall, nations do not always rise stronger. Sometimes they crumble. Sometimes the stability, flawed as it may be, that held society together was the only thing preventing total collapse. The conspirators believed they were cutting out a cancer. Instead, they cut into the very heart of Rome, and the wound never stopped bleeding until an entirely new political body emerged. In the end, Caesar triumphed in death in a way he never could in life. His name became immortal. His legacy birthed an empire, and those who killed him faded into the shadows of history, remembered not as saviors of liberty, but as men who underestimated the power of the world they tried to control. Caesar's assassination did not save Rome. It destroyed the world the conspirators claimed to protect and reshaped the course of history in ways they could never have predicted. When you step into the final stretch of this journey, when the echoes of everything you've lived, felt, survived, and questioned begin to settle into a deeper understanding, something begins to shift inside you, quietly, slowly, but unmistakably. It's that holy realization that the story isn't closing, it's actually opening. And as you breathe in this moment, after everything that built the tension of each chapter, you begin to understand why the sixth part matters so much. Because this is the part where you realize you didn't just observe transformation, you lived it. You didn't just listen to a narrative, you passed through it. You didn't just hear about awakening, you began to awaken. There is something profoundly sacred about reaching a place where the lessons you resisted become the lessons that shape you. where the battles that exhausted you become the proof of what you're capable of, where the silence you once feared becomes the doorway to hearing God more clearly. It's in this space now, as everything slows down, that the weight of your own story begins to feel different. Not lighter because the challenges vanished, but lighter because you finally understand their purpose. You've carried things you thought would break you. You've endured moments that felt impossible to explain. You've kept walking through storms that didn't stop when you prayed, didn't ease when you begged, didn't shift when you hoped. And yet here you are, still breathing, still reaching, still showing up, not by accident, not by luck, but because God intended for you to reach this exact point in your journey. This part isn't about victory that comes from suddenly winning a battle. This is about the quieter, deeper victory that comes from realizing you never stopped fighting. It's about understanding that endurance is a language of heaven, persistence is a form of worship. Choosing not to give up, even when nothing made sense, was one of the most powerful declarations of your faith. There is a kind of strength you gain only from seasons where you had no strength left, yet kept going. There is a kind of wisdom you gain only from seasons where you didn't know what to do, yet kept listening. And there is a level of spiritual authority you gain only from seasons where everything inside you screamed to give up and you refused. That's the version of you standing here now, the version shaped not by ease, but by endurance. Not by clarity, but by trust. Not by knowing what God was doing, but by believing He was doing something even when you couldn't see it. This part of your journey is about understanding that the slow, long, hidden work that God was doing within you has finally begun to rise to the surface, that the seeds buried in the dark are sprouting, that the prayers you whispered when no one saw are stirring, that the tears you shed without anyone knowing were never wasted, that the waiting you thought was empty was shaping a foundation strong enough to carry what comes next. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you're beginning to feel something shift inside you, something like relief, something like hope, something like a deep breath that you didn't know you needed, because you're realizing what God was doing wasn't punishment, it was preparation. What looked like delay was actually divine timing. What felt like a setback was strategic positioning. What seemed like God's silence was Him crafting every detail with precision that required your patience. God was not ignoring you. He was constructing the very thing you were praying for in a way that would actually last. But to understand the beauty of this moment, you have to understand the weight of the journey behind it. Think back to the nights when you questioned everything. Think back to the moments when loneliness felt louder than truth. Think back to the situations where you didn't know how you would survive, how you would recover, or how you would move forward. Yet every step brought you here, to this point where your heart is beginning to make peace with what your life has been, even as it prepares for what it's about to become. God didn't bring you this far to leave you with half-finished healing, half-grown strength, or half-developed purpose. This final stretch is where everything begins to connect. There is something incredibly powerful about recognizing that God is not only the God of your breakthrough, but also the God of your becoming. He doesn't just open doors, He prepares you to walk through them. He doesn't just give blessings, He shapes you so you won't mishandle them. He doesn't just answer prayers, He grows you into the kind of person who can carry the weight of those answers. This entire journey, every struggle, every confusion, every silence, was forming a version of you that would be ready not only to receive, but to steward. And now you stand at the edge of that moment, not with fear, but with a readiness you didn't realize was building inside you. You are no longer the person you were at the beginning of this journey. You are wiser, stronger, softer in the right places, and tougher in the places that used to break too easily. You are more aware of God's presence, more anchored in faith, more grounded in truth. You learned that God doesn't always remove the storm. Sometimes he builds you into a person who can walk through storms without collapsing. You learned that answers don't always come immediately. Sometimes God grows you into the answer. You learned that healing isn't always instant. Sometimes it's layered, deep, slow, and deeply transformative. You learned that your heart can break and still beat. You learned that your spirit can fall and still rise. You learned that you can lose much and still not lose yourself. This final part of the journey is where everything inside you rises to meet what God is placing in front of you. It's where you realize that the waiting season was not passive, it was productive. You weren't just sitting still, you were being rebuilt from the inside out. And now, as you stand in this moment, that rebuilding begins to reveal itself. You start noticing that you react differently, think differently, move differently. Situations that used to overwhelm you no longer have the same power. Fears that once controlled your decisions no longer hold the same influence. Doubts that used to paralyze you now meet a stronger, more mature version of your faith. This is the point where you start to realize that what God was developing in you was not just strength. It was spiritual maturity, the ability to discern, the ability to trust without seeing, the ability to remain grounded when everything around you feels uncertain, the ability to walk with God even when your feelings pull in opposite directions, the ability to let peace lead instead of panic, the ability to surrender without fear. These are the qualities that elevate a person from surviving life to stepping into purpose. And you're stepping into that now. There is a beautiful stillness in this moment, not the kind that comes from having no challenges left, but the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer the same fragile version of yourself that entered them. You carry something now that you didn't have before, a deeper knowing, a deeper confidence, a deeper connection with God, and that connection changes everything, because once you have encountered God in your deepest struggles, you will never again doubt His presence in your future victories. This part of your journey is not just reflection, it's activation. It's the moment where all the inner work begins to take form on the outside, the moment where preparation meets purpose, the moment where endurance meets opportunity, the moment where healing meets calling, the moment where everything that felt delayed suddenly begins to align. There's a quickening in the spirit when you reach this stage, a feeling that what's coming is not random, not rushed, not accidental. It's intentional, it's timely, and it's personal. You begin to feel that God is not just restoring what you lost. He is upgrading what you expected, not just answering what you prayed. He is exceeding what you imagined. Not just healing what broke, He is strengthening what remains. Not just fulfilling what you hoped, He is transforming what you believed was impossible. This is the part where you begin to see the fingerprints of His faithfulness on every part of your story. The closed doors make sense, the delays make sense, the detours make sense, the disappointments make sense, because you realize now that God was not withholding anything from you. He was protecting something in you. He was preparing something for you, and He was aligning something ahead of you. You begin to notice how far you've come, not because everything is finished, but because everything has shifted. And as you breathe into this new clarity, you feel yourself stepping into a chapter where you're no longer reacting to life. You're participating in purpose. You're no longer grasping for control. You're resting in trust. You're no longer trying to force outcomes. You're flowing with God's timing. You're no longer asking, "Why me?" You're asking, "What are you shaping in me?" You're no longer defined by what hurt. You're shaped by what healed. You're no longer bound by what broke. You're empowered by what rebuilt. This final part of the script is the moment where you lift your head, square your shoulders, and realize you're stepping into the version of yourself that God always intended. A version forged through pressure, strengthened through storms, refined through waiting, deepened through prayer, anchored through faith. A version of you that sees differently, hears differently, prays differently, chooses differently. A version of you that understands that every chapter behind you was necessary and every chapter ahead of you is divine. And so you step forward, not in fear, not in hesitation, not in uncertainty, but in quiet, steady, unshakable confidence. Confidence not in your ability, but in God's faithfulness. Confidence not in your strength, but in His sovereignty. Confidence not in what you have, but in who He is. You walk now with the awareness that you are not stepping into the unknown. You are stepping into the promises. Not stepping into confusion, you are stepping into alignment. Not stepping into hope alone. You are stepping with the one who carried you through every moment of the journey. And as this last part expands in your heart, something becomes